Before Paris became the city of light, before its grand boulevards, Gothic towers, and iron monuments defined the imagination of the world, it was little more than a small island rising from the waters of the Seine. There was no glamour then, no royal prestige, no artistic aura. There was only mud, timber, river traffic, and a patch of land whose value lay not in beauty, but in survival. On the Île de la Cité, the first version of Paris began to take shape. If you look at the geography, the logic becomes obvious. The island sat in a position that offered both protection and control. In the ancient world, rivers were the true highways of commerce. Whoever controlled a crossing point controlled movement, trade, and information. The settlement that formed here did not emerge from fantasy or ambition. It emerged because the land itself offered advantages too practical to ignore. It was defensible. It was connected. It could feed a growing population and anchor a wider network of exchange. When the Romans arrived, they did not see the future capital of France. They saw strategic potential. They called the settlement Lutetia. Under Roman influence, it slowly acquired the features of an organized town. Roads, bridges, public structures, markets, and military presence. Yet Lutetia was not Paris as we know it. It was a working town of the empire, meant to serve administration and order. It existed as part trading post, part military foothold, part logistical node, in a much larger Roman system stretching across Gaul. That beginning matters because it reveals something essential about Paris. The city was not first imagined as a center of culture or philosophy. It was born from geography. The Seine was not simply a backdrop. It was the force that made the settlement possible. Traders moved along it carrying goods, tools, food, and wealth. Soldiers crossed it carrying commands, authority, and violence. Around those currents, a town slowly formed, shaped by necessity rather than myth. This first Paris was a city of function. It lived by its position and by the opportunities created by that position. The island allowed people to defend themselves, but it also allowed them to reach outward. It tied local survival to regional connection. That balance between protection and openness would remain a defining trait of Paris through the centuries. Even when the city later became a center of religion, learning, revolution, and modern spectacle, those later identities still rested on this deeper foundation. Paris existed because it sat at the right place in the flow of the world. So the earliest Paris was not elegant, not symbolic, not yet monumental. It was practical. It was useful. It was a place where water and land met, and where human beings recognized opportunity. In that sense, the city's first invention was not ideological at all. It was geographic. Long before kings chose it, before bishops sanctified it, before intellectuals transformed it, the river had already made the first decision. Paris began because the Seine made it worth beginning. The city that would one day enchant the world was, at first, simply a place where geography became power. Paris changed forever when it ceased to be merely a useful settlement and became a sacred center of power. If Lutetia gave the city its bones, the Middle Ages gave it a soul. The turning point came with Clovis I, the Frankish king whose conversion to Catholic Christianity reshaped not only his own rule, but the destiny of Paris itself. In the early medieval world, religion and politics were inseparable. Clovis's conversion was not just a private act of faith, it was a bold act of statecraft. By aligning himself with Catholic Christianity rather than rival religious currents, he gained moral authority, political legitimacy, and the support of a powerful church structure. When Paris was chosen as a capital in 511, it no longer stood merely as a strategic location on a river. It became the heart of a new order in which kingship and sanctity were closely intertwined. This was the second invention of Paris. It was no longer simply the Roman river town. It became a city of kings, relics, churches, and ceremony. Places such as Saint-Denis played a major role in this transformation. Saint-Denis was not only a religious site, it became a royal burial place, a ceremonial space, and a symbol of dynastic continuity. In other words, Paris became more than politically important. It became spiritually charged. Royal memory and sacred space merged, and the city's meaning deepened. But the sacralization of Paris did not happen only through ritual and monarchy. It happened through architecture. The rise of Gothic design gave Paris a new visual language, one that turned faith into stone and light. Buildings grew taller, arches stretched higher, walls opened into vast stained glass windows that flooded interiors with colored light. Gothic architecture was not merely decorative. It expressed a theological vision. It sought to lift the human mind upward, to make the invisible feel present, to create an earthly echo of heaven. The clearest symbol of that ambition was Notre-Dame. More than a cathedral, it was a declaration of what Paris had become. This was no longer a city defined by commerce and military convenience alone. It had become a stage for sacred imagination. The cathedral's height, symmetry, sculptural detail, and luminous windows all announced that Paris had entered a different realm of significance. Here, power was not only exercised, it was sanctified. That matters because the Paris of this era became an idea as much as a place. It was the city where royal authority and divine order reinforced each other. It was a center where stone buildings carried theology, and where the skyline itself reflected spiritual ambition. Paris was being remade into something larger than a town. It was becoming a symbol. So the second Paris was the Paris of God, a city of bells, relics, liturgy, coronation, burial, and sacred architecture. Its identity no longer rested mainly on geography. It now rested on belief. The river still flowed beneath it, but above that river rose towers and vaults announcing a new truth. Paris had been chosen not just by the logic of land, but by the logic of faith. In this second form, it became a city that sought not only to endure in the world, but to connect the world to heaven. But Paris did not stop at becoming a sacred city. If it had remained only a place of kings and cathedrals, it might have been remembered as a major medieval capital, but not as one of the most influential cities in European civilization. What pushed Paris further was its ability to become not only a center of belief, but a center of thought. At a certain point, the city began to do more than rule and pray. It began to argue, question, and teach. By the 12th century, Paris was emerging as one of Europe's great centers of learning. Schools multiplied, scholars gathered, institutions that would later be associated with the Sorbonne took shape, and the Latin Quarter became known as a district of books, lectures, debate, and intellectual life. This was the third invention of Paris. It was no longer simply the city of sacred authority. It was becoming a city of ideas. In the medieval period, Paris gained enormous prestige as a center of theology. Students and masters came from across Europe to study scripture, philosophy, and the structure of the world. Yet, what truly mattered was not only the content of what they studied, but the culture of inquiry that developed around them. Paris was becoming a place where truth was not only received, but examined. Scholars disputed interpretations, refined arguments, challenged assumptions, and built methods of thought that shaped intellectual life far beyond France. That tradition of debate did not fade. Over time, it evolved. By the early modern era, especially during the Enlightenment, Paris became the setting for an even more explosive intellectual transformation. In salons, private homes, academies, and publishing networks, writers and philosophers gathered to discuss society, power, religion, law, and human nature. Figures such as Voltaire and Rousseau became associated with a world in which ideas circulated with tremendous force. Projects like the Encyclopédie symbolized a new ambition to gather, organize, and spread knowledge in a way that could reshape civilization itself. This was a profound shift. The Paris of Gothic cathedrals had tried to lift the soul toward heaven. The Paris of the Enlightenment brought the human mind back down to earth and asked it to examine everything. Why should kings rule by divine right? Why should inherited custom outweigh reason? Why should institutions be obeyed merely because they are old? These were dangerous questions, and Paris became one of the places where they were asked most powerfully. That is why the third Paris matters so much. It was a city that learned how to produce influence through ideas. It no longer shaped Europe only through monarchy, religion, or architecture. It shaped Europe by teaching people how to think differently. It turned books into weapons, conversations into political pressure, and knowledge into a form of power. So Paris, in this era, became the capital of intellect. It was a place where theology, philosophy, criticism, and public debate all converged. A city once organized by stones and shrines now also lived through manuscripts, lectures, essays, and argument. And when a city becomes a workshop for the mind, its influence stretches far beyond its walls. Paris was no longer just a location on a map. It had become a force inside the imagination of Europe, a city capable of changing not just how people lived, but how they understood the world itself. But any city that becomes too important also becomes vulnerable. Paris was not only a place of brilliance, belief, and intellect. It was also a prize, and prizes are fought over. Because Paris stood at the center of power, religion, and national identity, it became a city that many forces wanted to control. That is why its fourth reinvention did not come through glory, but through fracture. Paris had to become a city of crisis before it could become something new again. During the 100 Years' War, Paris experienced one of the harshest truths in its history. Centrality does not guarantee security. When the English occupied the city between 1420 and 1436, Paris became a symbol not of French strength, but of French vulnerability. Even Joan of Arc, who came to represent resistance and hope, failed to recover the city at its gates. That detail is especially striking. It reminds us that Paris was not always the triumphant stage of national greatness. At times, it stood as evidence of defeat, confusion, and the painful reality that power can slip away even from those who seem destined to reclaim it. Yet military occupation was only one layer of the city's crisis. The religious wars of the 16th century tore at Paris from within. These conflicts were not simply wars between neighboring states. They were battles over belief, legitimacy, and the soul of France itself. The siege of Henry IV, the unrest fueled by the Catholic League, and the famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass," all reveal how brutally the city was pulled between conviction and political calculation. That phrase remains so powerful because it captures the unsettling realism of power. To possess Paris was to possess more than territory. It was to claim France's symbolic center. Whoever held Paris could present himself as the true ruler of the kingdom. That meant religion, principle, and public order were constantly entangled with strategy. In this period, the city became a battleground of ideas as much as armies. Streets, churches, gates, and districts were all drawn into the conflict. What made this era especially tragic was that Paris did not merely suffer external damage. Its internal identity was strained almost to breaking point. Was it the city of God or the city of political compromise? Was it the capital of learning or a space governed by fear and faction? Was it united or permanently divided by confessional hatred? These were not abstract questions. They were lived realities, felt in daily suspicion, shifting loyalties, and the instability of public life. And that is why this fourth Paris matters so much. It shows that the city did not grow only through beauty or brilliance. It also grew through rupture. It learned what it meant to be occupied, contested, and morally exhausted. It discovered that importance carries a cost. The greater the symbolic value of Paris became, the more fiercely others struggled to define it. So Paris, in this era, was a shattered city, not always ruined in stone, but deeply shaken in spirit. It was a city pulled in multiple directions, uncertain of its own center, forced to endure siege, division, and compromise. Yet even this brokenness would become part of its identity, because sometimes a city must first be torn apart before it can be imagined again. After centuries shaped by kings, bishops, scholars, and civil conflict, Paris entered a new age in which history would no longer be made only in palaces, churches, or universities. It would now be made in the streets. This was the fifth invention of Paris, and perhaps its most explosive one: Paris as the city of revolution. In 1789, when the Bastille was stormed, the event mattered for more than military or political reasons. The Bastille was not simply a fortress prison. It had become a symbol of arbitrary royal power, fear, and the weight of the old regime. Its fall announced that the people of Paris were no longer content to remain spectators in the making of history. They entered history directly, with force, urgency, and collective will. The city itself became the stage on which an old political order began to collapse. What makes revolutionary Paris so powerful is its physicality. Revolution here was not abstract. It was audible in the shouting of crowds, visible in the movement of bodies, and tangible in the transformation of urban space. Public squares became arenas of judgment, streets filled with demonstrations, rumors, speeches, and confrontation. Politics no longer belonged only to kings and ministers, it spilled outward into daily life. In Paris, the city became political matter, and the revolutionary spirit did not vanish after 1789. Throughout the 19th century, Paris remained a place where urban life and political action fused again and again. The July Revolution of 1830, the barricades rising across the streets, the recurring eruptions of unrest all revealed something distinctive about this city. Its streets could become battlefields almost overnight. Barricades were not only practical defenses, they were symbols of a population claiming ownership of history through the very structure of the city. This is what set Paris apart. It was not merely a capital where revolutions happened. It became a capital defined by the possibility of revolution. The people of Paris repeatedly showed that they believed power could be confronted, governments could be challenged, and society itself could be remade through collective action. The road, the square, the bridge, and the neighborhood all acquired political meaning. Everyday urban space became charged with the potential for upheaval. That is why the Fifth Paris was so different from the earlier ones. The city of sacred monarchy had become the city of popular sovereignty. The city of royal authority and theological prestige had become the city of mass politics. Paris was now a place where legitimacy came under public attack, where crowds could topple symbols, and where the future of the nation could pivot on events unfolding block by block. So Paris in revolt became more than a French city. It became a global image of political awakening. It stood for liberty, upheaval, defiance, and the dangerous energy of ordinary people refusing to remain silent. In this form, Paris rewrote its own destiny. It was no longer merely designed from above, it was claimed from below. And once a city learns that its streets can change history, it can never entirely return to being passive again. The Paris the world recognizes today did not simply grow naturally out of the medieval city. It was imposed, redesigned, and in many ways invented through destruction. After centuries of congestion, unrest, and revolutionary upheaval, the French state moved to reinvent Paris once again, this time through urban planning on a massive scale. This was the Sixth Paris, modern Paris, the city that had to be broken apart in order to become a global icon. The central figure in this transformation was Baron Haussmann, working under Napoleon III. His redesign of Paris cut wide boulevards through dense medieval neighborhoods, reshaped circulation, standardized facades, and created the monumental urban image now associated with the city. Streets that had once been narrow, irregular, and difficult to control were replaced by grand avenues, open vistas, and coherent blocks of stone buildings. Paris became visually unified, elegant, and unmistakably modern. But beauty was only part of the story. Haussmann's redesign also had a political logic. Wide boulevards made barricades harder to build and easier to dismantle. Troops could move faster, surveillance improved. The modern city was not simply more beautiful, it was more governable. This is one of the great paradoxes of Paris. The city admired for its harmony and romance was also shaped by fear of disorder. It was made attractive, but also manageable. From there, Paris stepped onto the world stage with even greater confidence. The great international exhibitions of the 19th century turned it into a showcase of modern civilization. Paris was no longer only the city of cathedrals, palaces, and revolutions. It became a city of display, technology, and spectacle. Then, in 1889, the Eiffel Tower rose above the skyline. At first controversial, it would become one of the most recognizable structures on Earth. The contrast could not be clearer. Notre-Dame represented the Paris of faith, stone, and medieval transcendence. The Eiffel Tower represented the Paris of iron, engineering, and industrial ambition. One reached toward heaven through sacred symbolism. The other announced modernity through structure, height, and technical daring. Together, they reveal the strange brilliance of Paris, a city capable of carrying radically different eras in a single skyline. And yet, modern Paris did not become a frozen museum. It continued to suffer, adapt, and reinvent itself. The city lived through war, through the trauma of 20th century conflict, through the 2015 terrorist attacks, through the shock of the 2019 Notre-Dame fire, and then through efforts to present itself once more as a global stage in moments like the 2024 Olympics. Even in the present, Paris remains a city of wounds and recovery. So the sixth Paris is not simply the modern capital of postcards and cinema. It is a city repeatedly reshaped by power, ambition, violence, and resilience. It was demolished in parts so it could become legible to the world. It was scarred, yet never fixed in one final form. From the island in the Seine to the boulevards of Haussmann, from Gothic vaults to iron towers, Paris has never been built only once. It has been reinvented again and again, and perhaps that is the true reason it fascinates the world. Paris is not just a city with history, it is a city made out of repeated rebirths.